Okay, welcome everybody. We are covering an interesting topic tonight. It's a little bit of philosophy and fact, if you will. Of course, I'm going to start off with a lot more of the philosophy side of it, and then Dr. Tiffany and Dr. Jordan are going to be going through a lot of the real details behind it. And this is a mountain of information. I mean, you could literally go on this topic forever, but ironically, it's one that we really haven't talked about, but has come up through, just some recent stories, if you will, which, I don't know that I really want to, use specifics, but you guys all know somebody in this situation, right? So the topic is what you can't see can hurt you, okay? Because, of course, everybody always says, what you don't know can't hurt you, what you can't see can't hurt you, what you don't do can't hurt you, all this stuff. But the reality is we're all subject to our environment. We're all subject to the things that are around us. And so, yes, they absolutely can. But how does that affect your daily life? How does that affect your daily walk, if you will? It's you even think of it from a faith perspective, right? I'm sure you've all heard a sermon or two spoken on this, how bad things happen in the world, but does that mean that all is lost? No, it's how you handle it, it's how you deal with it, it's how you walk forward despite the stuff that actually happens. That's the thing that counts. So if we get the direction, no, I just tapped the laser. Okay, so has anybody in here read the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell? We got one, we got two. Is that it? Okay, good book. Y'all need to go and read this book. So this is Malcolm Gladwell here, if you care. Malcolm Gladwell's breakthrough book tells the statistical stories of so-called outliers. Okay, outliers are these marvelous stories of success outside of the norm. So some of these outliers that he talks about in the book are like professional hockey players, or he talks about Bill Gates, or he talks about a lawyer in New York who is has one of the biggest firms in New York that handles, millions and millions, probably in the billions of dollars in assets and such. Well, how did these people come about? How did Mark Zuckerberg come about? Is it just the fact that they're outright brilliant, one of a kind, Taylor Swift, all these people? How is it that these people get to this state, right? Is it because they're just truly one of a kind? Okay, and what he actually found is the truth is that most people live in the norm. Just most people live in the bell curve. But these so-called outliers, there's a reality that circumstance plays a major role in every aspect of life. It's vastly more important than what we want to give credit to, especially those that are in those spots, right? If you think about it, take a top, musical artist, okay, Taylor Swift or, whatever, somebody else. They would tell you, no, it's because of my unique talent, my unique natural abilities and my hard work and this and that and all the other. But the reality is, and this is what he came across in his book, is that those people, it's not something that is just inborn into them. They had a tremendous amount of circumstance that happened that got them to where they are. Right? It was in terms of hockey. One of the studies that they did in this book was they looked at hockey players, and they found that of professional hockey players, some ridiculous number like 93% of professional hockey players were born in January and February. Why is that? I mean, that's incredible, right? Why would 90-something% of professional hockey players be born in 2 months out of 12? And what it comes down to is simply that when they're in the youth level, those that are born in the earliest part of the year, January or February, they are bigger than all of the other kids that were born 6 months or 8 months or 10 months later. Okay, so when you're playing hockey, does 10 months make a big deal when you're 5 to 6 years old? Absolutely. It is like you're playing against monsters at that level. So those kids, because they're bigger, or a little bit faster or whatever it is, they're the ones that make it onto the elite teams and get picked up by the coaches as special, right? And so really what that means is because they're getting better training and better coaching all along the way because of this little statistical advantage, they end up at the top. It's not because they were better than the kid that was born in November. Pretty incredible, right? So the point of all this is that, what we see as outliers of the story, good or bad or the other, there's always circumstance that is behind everything. Everything that we look at, there's always some degree of circumstance behind it. You either benefit from it or you don't benefit from it. I mean, it can be either end of the spectrum. And, where most of us live in this normal pattern, there are going to be those outlier circumstances in all of our lives, right? There's going to be those little things that make a big difference for each individual person. But all we see, is the ones that are at the tippy top, right? The ones that Bill Gates, he was one of the stories in there, and it was basically how he had early access because of his geographical location. He happened to be right by the first university that got access to, I think it was access to the internet, to be able to learn coding. And so he showed an interest in going and getting access to it. But if I remember right, there was something about you were only supposed to get so much time to be able to be allotted to going in the room and working on this computer, but he actually cheated the system or something like that, and he was able to spend a lot more hours in there than he was supposed to be able to. So bottom line, he learned coding first because of his geographical location, and look where it got him. You sit at dinner with him, is he the smartest guy on the planet? Absolutely not. You look at all these different examples in there, and it's just remarkable. The attorney in New York, that guy, it was basically just because of this certain window of time, where the laws changed or something like that, that he became epically wealthy because he was the first adopter. He was the early adopter, and you just go on and on through all this stuff, the crypto bubble and all that. I mean, all of that stuff. There's early adopters and everything else, but there's always a reason why. And it's not necessarily just because, oh, well, they're different. They're special. I mean, they're special. They happen to be in the right place at the right time. Okay, so how does that play into all this? Why does it matter? Well, why does the healthiest person I know still develop a brain tumor? Did you guys ever hear that one? I'll use an example. Okay, and this is actually a real example. I had a good friend that was a chiropractor, and we practiced in correlation, if you will, for years and years and years. Dr. Tiffany, I think she was a CA at the time. Don't. So she was like the epitome of health. I mean, she did CrossFit. She was serious about diet and supplementation. She was just a raging, on fire, full of life chiropractor. And all of a sudden, she started having problems, and then they found that she had cancer. She had a brain tumor. And it was, the whole thing happened like so fast and everything, and then she died. And she was 27, 30, maybe, something like that. I mean, she was not old at all. I mean, she had a tremendous career ahead of her. I mean, she was probably the busiest. I know she was the busiest chiropractor on the Eastern Shore, period. I mean, incredible lady. I know another one. Dr. Charles Majors, he was in an organization that we were a part of, and he was in the Chicago area. And this guy, he saw his practice was probably 5-6 times busier than ours is. I mean, it is just huge, helping a ton of people, had numerous doctors working with him, had multiple clinics, I think. And same thing. I mean, same story, just did everything right. But then he was adjusting a patient and he collapsed on top of him. Like literally, I mean, imagine we're adjusting your thoracics and all of a sudden we just limp and fell on top of you. That would be weird, right? And so come to find out, he had a brain tumor wrapped around his brain stem. And he actually, when it all kind of made sense, they went to the doctor, and this is really the kind of cool part to that story, is every time he got adjusted, he felt like he just came alive again. Like, you guys know what it means, you know, to get adjusted, and you're like, woo. No, this guy literally came alive again. And the reason why is the way that his brain tumor was sitting on his brainstem, anytime that he shifted out of alignment, it would literally choke off cerebrospinal fluid flow. So the minute that he got adjusted, it literally pushed through cerebrospinal fluid to his spinal cord, and it was like getting flush with oxygen. So he actually went down and did treatment at the same place that my sister did treatment at down in Mexico, but he actually ended up passing away also, right? So, you know, these are just two literally chiropractors that I know. Like, I mean, the ones teaching wellness, and they're examples of what happens here. Okay, but what about on the other hand? Why does your 96-year-old uncle live so long despite smoking, drinking, and eating whatever he wants? Anybody have one of those? Somebody that you know, it doesn't have to be your uncle, but anybody know somebody like that? Yeah, and you're like, how is it that this person can literally cheat death every day and yet continue to live and seemingly do fine? And you know, you interview centenarians and come and find out that they drink a Coca-Cola every day, or they drink half a bottle of wine every day, or what, I mean, we all know, we've heard these examples. Okay, well, what's the point then in trying to be healthy if random chance means that it's all for naught? Right? Who's heard that before? Right? Well, I'm not going to be healthy because, you know, when it's my time, it's my time. You ever heard that? Yeah, that line drives us nuts. It drives us absolutely mad because you literally can't help someone like that. You know what I mean? Now, if that's I hate to say it, the cop-out, you can't help someone in that situation. So here's the point. You know, it's all about really balancing the equation, okay? You look at this picture. This is a great illustration of the point I'm making here. What's odd about this picture?
The big guy's up.
She's tiny and the big guy's up, right? So everybody sees that. What are you not seeing?
Who's holding a girl?
What do you mean?
Somebody's holding the girl down.
There you go. So you can't see the other end of the teeter-totter. There could be a boulder sitting on the other side. There could be, you know, someone twice the size of that one sitting on the other side. You know, so the point is, we don't always see the full picture. All we see is the outcome, right? So this is really what's important. This is the equation. It's internal resistance versus external influence. Have you guys ever heard that before? Okay, we probably talked about this in previous workshops. The moral of the story here is, you know, we all talk about like the germ theory of disease, which is a theory. It's not a fact. So the germ theory says that if you get exposed, you're going to get sick. COVID, right? You know, if somebody sneezes on you, you're going to get COVID. If you touch the same surface, you're going to get COVID. You know, all this stuff. That's the picture that's always taught. But the reality is your internal resistance is always battling against external influence. So this is why you can have a room this big and I could make foaming spit bubbles on every single person in here and only one... Who wants to go first? Only one of you is going to get sick, right? Only one person gets sick. The rest of you are perfectly fine. Nothing happened. In fact, you go and lick the floor afterwards, and you're perfectly fine, right? Why does that happen? Because internal resistance, your internal resistance was greater than the external influence that you were subject to. It's that simple. That is the equation of health. Now, you take that a step further, there are positives and negatives to each side of the equation that you can't see. Okay, it's not just the things that you can see, it's the things that you can't see. You don't always know that are there. What you choose to do from a lifestyle perspective at least slants the odds in your favor. That's the whole point in a wellness care model. That's the whole point that the medical system seems to not really understand, or maybe just ignore altogether, is that anybody notice the trend within medicine that everything now is moving towards genetic testing? Okay, completely ignoring the fact how much has the genetic sequence changed in the last, say, 40,000 years, or 2,000 years, or 300 years. It hasn't changed. I mean, as long as we can see genetic samples, there has been no change. So how come all of a sudden everything is a genetic problem? Everything is a genetic defect. A sequence alteration, or a genetic mutation. Why is it that all of a sudden all this is coming up, and everybody seems so interested in it? Because if we can make you think that it is genetic, what's your chances of overcoming it? Zero. Therefore, you got to do what we tell you to do. You got to take this drug, you got to do this, you got to have this surgery, whatever it is, you just have to do it because it's genetic. You can't get away from it. That's why the drive is within healthcare moving in that direction. Okay, so things you can't, things you can. That's the point. It's all about stacking the deck in your favor. So the can'ts, genetics. That's probably the biggest one. That is the next God knows how many decades of healthcare. This is where the model is going. And a lot of that too is pushed along the side, jumping ahead to vaccines, because the market in healthcare, pharmaceutical industry is moving away from drugs. Did you guys know that? That is their objective, is to really get away from medications. Their number one, business product, they want to eliminate their reliance on. And what are they going to move to instead? They want to move to vaccines. Because one simple reason. Zero, finish the statement, liability. Okay? So every drug that's out there, they get a 7-year patent on it? And then after that, they're going to be subject to all the liability risk. Somewhere down the line, they're going to have to pay, they know, millions and millions and millions of dollars in lawsuits. They actually calculated it into their price from the beginning. When they market and they price a product, they build that in based on what the risks are that they see in their initial drug studies. So if they know it causes this, and this many people are expected to die, this many people are expected to get cancer, et cetera, then they're going to inflate how much they know they're going to have to pay in lawsuits to cover that segment of people, and that means the drug is going to cost X amount. That's why you look at some of these drugs and it's like, oh my gosh, how are we going to afford this drug? It's $40,000, over 6 months. Why? Because it's got a real good chance that it's going to seriously harm you. That's why it's inflated that much. Okay, so vaccines, on the other hand, they are unique because they carry zero liability. They already did away with that. You cannot, if you got a blood clot because of the COVID vaccine, you cannot sue for it. You volunteered to take it, right? And because it literally says, here's what's funny about it. The pharmaceutical industry, they go by the standpoint that a vaccine is dangerous by design. And therefore, because it's dangerous by design, i.e. adjuvants going directly into your bloodstream, therefore we can't make them liable for it because it's dangerous by design. You know, why? I mean, if we know it's dangerous, how can we go and make them liable for the risk? Seems like a great justification, right? You know, when you're an attorney for the big drug companies. So genetics, early development. Can you do anything about the things that happened when you were a kid? I know I can't. You know, I can't do anything about the 11 years of allergy shots that I did. I can't do anything about the 17 years of steroid nasal sprays and antibiotics and everything else that I did as a kid. Until I was 17, I had no clue. That's when I said, I'm done. I stopped. Okay. So early development is a factor. Environmental toxins. You don't know what's around you all the time. I mean, just think every time you eat at a restaurant and you eat off of a fork, do you ask them what kind of detergent they use? Do you ask what kind of drying agents they use? Anybody? No. Have you ever? No. We don't think about it. We trust that it's, you know, good stuff, but I'm telling you right now, it's not. I mean, these are things that if you got these chemicals on your hands, they would melt your hands. I mean, it's bad stuff, but it's the dose that makes the poison, you know. No, I mean, I'm sorry, poison is poison, especially when it's all around you. Radiation, can you do anything about radiation? Did you guys see now what country was it? France? Yeah, France is banning the iPhone 12 because it exceeds radiation limits. Mm-hmm. You know, can you get away from, I mean,
You'd be surprised how many of them exceed it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're carrying around in our pockets. Mm-hmm. You know, it's our, like, yeah, and putting them next to our skulls. Yeah, you guys ever do that where if you can't find your car in a parking lot, this is a neat party trick, but you buzz and nothing happens, you put your beeper up next to your head and hit the button, and your car will unlock from like 3 times the distance. You didn't know that? Try it. Try it. It works because your head's an antenna. Yeah, so your head is an antenna. And so when we put our cell phone next to our head, we're dramatically amplifying the signal.
Yeah, but it has that little thing where you can make it louder, right? You don't have to do that. You know,
speakerphone? Yeah, I always speak on speakerphone. Always. Like, I cannot stand having a phone next to my head. All right, so radiation, electromagnetics goes in the same category. Environmental circumstance. That means, like, you know, you can't do anything if you're, I had a patient recently who was working on a ship and he had to make a jump for it because of a chlorine gas cloud coming towards him, right? So, you know, busted limbs and stuff because of, you know, I mean, can he do anything about that? He didn't see that coming, right? So things like that happen. Social circumstance. Do you think there's some social circumstance going on around the world right now? I mean, look at Ukraine and look at Israel. These are social circumstances that a lot of people have nothing to do with, you know, but they're subject to it either way. That's a definite can't. Location goes in the same factor. Human error. What was, that was soccer. Yeah, that's kind of less of an issue, but we're Liverpool fans, they had a goal scratched off because the on-field referee called offside, and the guy on the VAR check thought he was onside, and so he had said check complete, and they continued playing the game when he was actually onside the entire game. And they lost the game because of that, right? That's human error, you know. So it affects soccer and life. So now the cans, we've got diet, exercise, personal hygiene, grooming. Grooming makes a factor. I mean, haven't you guys seen the studies where I think you told me that last week, or you did, that those that are wearing a business suit are less likely to get mugged. You would think it would be the opposite. I mean, you would think that if you were dressed nicely, you would be a target because you probably got something on you, you know, but it's the opposite. I guess people figure you're more equipped if you're well groomed. But does it not affect opportunity?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. You know, so opportunity affects social circumstance. Social circumstance affects economics. Economics affects how you are able to diet and exercise, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So grooming has a major factor in things that people, you know, go into Walmart, you can see people don't pay attention to this anymore. I mean, it's like, it's all over the place. Is it not the truth? I mean, when did pajamas become clothes? Drugs, chemicals, vaccines, those are kind of all in the same category. Location. Can you affect your location? Absolutely. I mean, you can decide where you're going to live. You can decide where you're going to work. You can decide, you know what, maybe I shouldn't put myself in that situation. You can decide these things. You know, so yes, your location can't always be good. We were watching the other day the new John Wick series on Peacock, the Continental. You know, and in one part there's this cook I mean, he's just outside smoking a cigarette or something like that, and he's just standing there as a guy runs by, and so he turns and shoots him as he runs by, and I immediately was like, wow, that guy was in a bad place at the wrong time. Like, you know, you can't decide situations like that, but there's a lot of locations that you absolutely can change. Your thoughts, your education, your habits, your discipline, your ethics, your morality, influence, even love, right? These things have a dramatic effect on what your individual circumstance and your individual collective circumstances are going to be, right? So the cool thing is most of these things you can see are in the category of what's between your ears. You know, it's the things that, which is, of course, because you can control it. It's right here, right? You can't necessarily control external influence, but you can control your internal resistance. Make sense?
Yeah.
All right. So from here, we're going to get into more nitty-gritty details, right? So Dr. Jordan's going to take it from here.
Thank you. All right, everyone. I'm Dr. Jordan Moore, one of the chiropractors here as well, and I'll be talking a little bit about genetics. You know, like he had mentioned as well before. A lot of us now label most diseases as being genetic, like, you know, familial hypercholesterolemia or a lot of cancers nowadays. They'll do specific genetic testing. But a lot of times you'll see patients with these genes that, you know, say they're supposed to have a certain disease, never express those genes, and vice versa. I mean, we've got patients we know that have had rheumatoid arthritis, for example, but never had the gene, diagnosed through blood work. Like, it never showed up, right? So in theory, they should never have this disease that they're expressing symptoms of. So I want to get into genes and epigenetics. Genes, we'll start from here. It's taking you back to high school biology. They're the units of heredity, and they describe how to make certain proteins. So genes are the building block, or the instructions on, why we look, how we look, some of our mannerisms, how we act, our emotional intelligence plays, genes play a small role into that as well. But genes are known as the building blocks of life. And epigenetics, if you take the word epi, it means above. Epigenetics are literally above genes, and they refer to the study of how cells control gene activity without changing the sequence. And what this means is you can have different signaling external influences, stress, you can have your diet, you can have different toxins that you come into contact with that don't change your genes, but they do allow expression. So we'll get into that in a second. But the epigenome, which is just all of your epigenetics, can be affected by positive experiences, such as supportive relationships, opportunities for learning, and also negatively with environmental toxins and stressful life circumstances. So this means that there are reasons for chronic disease and most lifestyle illnesses other than simply being told, oh, this is genetic. You were born to have this disease, right? So through lifestyle, you can have something called DNA methylation, which is just a little extra piece carbon and 2 more hydrogens attached to, this is one of your parts of your genes. And they can activate or repress your genes. So environmental chemicals, aging, diet, stress, drugs, or illicit or pharmaceuticals can all cause genes, different gene expression. And a little bit more technical here. So we have your epigenetic mechanisms or your lifestyle factors. And this right here is your chromosome. You got 23, pairs, so you got 46 total. And it has all your DNA here, so all your building blocks are on this purple part. Your lifestyle factors contribute what we call a methyl group into your DNA, and so if your body has this, it can either repress or express. It doesn't matter. It just changes how the body is now going to replicate the cells in the future. So because of these, things that were added into the body adapted and responded. And you can see autoimmune diseases, mental disorders, diabetes, cancer. Just because you had that gene, I want to say, you can have a methyl group attached to it and you can never express that cancer that you had the gene for, right? And vice versa. You can have that express a disease that you necessarily weren't subject to or supposed to have. So what does this mean? Your high blood pressure, your type 2 diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, sarcoidosis, lupus, tons of other autoimmune conditions, and genetic cancers don't necessarily have to be. There's a really famous psychologist, Jordan Peterson. A lot of you probably have heard of him. His daughter, Michaela, was diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis at a very young age. And she had, I think, 2 or 3 total joint fusions as a result, and she had 37 affected joints in her body. So what juvenile RA is, it's an autoimmune disease to where your body will attack the joint, right? You have severe inflammation. You can't move. It's stiff, rigid. She was very depressed, diagnosed infertile, underweight but very swollen, and she found that and she went years on antidepressants, immunosuppressants. She found that her diet was the cause of her illness, or contributing to her illness. So she'll always have this diagnosis, right, of rheumatoid arthritis, but because of what she was ingesting, she has now able to have a kid. She's married, and she also doesn't express any of the symptoms of the disease she was diagnosed with as a kid. And so she's an example of someone who trusted the medical field. Her father is a doctor. He trusts the medical field, but they ultimately found, after being told diet doesn't affect this disease, that you're just born with it, here's the drugs. They found that changing, their lifestyle, she now doesn't express the symptoms of the disease. And it's more likely that lifestyle contributes to the development and expression. I have that bold. When I say expression, I mean the symptoms of these diseases, even if we were susceptible to them in the first place. And just a quick image over there of gene expression in the body. But what we can do with the study of epigenetics and things that can affect gene transcription and stuff is avoid the diet and lifestyle of most Americans. And in parentheses, I have sedentary and full of processed foods. We'll get into processed foods a little bit more, but we need to increase our resistance to stress through exercise. So we need to remove the sedentary lifestyle. I have hot-cold therapy that's popular now. If you go on YouTube, you see a ton of people jumping into ice baths. And within limits, some intermittent fasting, and that's pretty popular too. But what these do is stress the body enough to make it better, inducing what's called a hormetic response. So by bringing a little bit of uncomfortableness to the body, you're bolstering it, you're making it a little bit stronger, a little bit more resilient, right? So choose a lifestyle of health and fulfillment, and eat a species appropriate diet. I write fulfillment in bold as well. You mentioned discipline, and a lot of Americans get their dopamine from quick sources, right? A lot of people go home from work, they're tired, they'll sit down, they'll have a food or a meal full of processed food, or pick up to go from their favorite fast food place, and sit down, watch Netflix for a couple hours, right? They're going for those quick sources of dopamine that make them happy in the moment. And what this does is it decreases motivation in people. And so I'm a big fan of removing the quick dopamine sources. This can be sugary foods. It can be, stimulating, it can be overconsumption of video games or, anything that gives you that immediate happiness without having to work for it in some way, right? So also learn to manage mental stress in a healthy way and not be victim to life's hardships. We're all going to go through really tough times, right? Everyone's been pretty beaten up, probably pretty frequently. Learning to accept that, and you can pray, guided meditation's great, but processing this in a healthy way so that you don't allow yourself to continue to be upset, right? You don't continue to express negative emotions, chronically be stressed. You'll tense, you'll tighten up. It'll destroy the body from the inside out. And I always tell my parents, it's pretty morbid, but I was like, look, if I were to pass away early before you guys can be sad for a month tops, but move on, right? Because if I was still here, I wouldn't want to see them mope and be sad constantly, right? I was like, you got to miss me at least a week, right? But that to be said, though, think about, if you ever had a loved one that passed, think about, they'd probably want you to be happy after. And so processing emotions plays a big role into the body's, stress management in general, right?
We have a whole workshop on that. That's one of my favorites, called Stressless. If you guys get on our YouTube, it's really one that I think everybody should watch.
And then some resources pertaining to epigenetics. The first one I read was on the right, Bruce Lipton. It's an older book, 10 plus years. It's The Biology of Belief. That one is about epigenetics and how, mostly the mental aspects and how they affect the expression of genes in the body. Not read this one. Richard C. Francis, Epigenetics, How the Environment Shapes Our Genes is a good one. Another good one, Ben Lynch, Dirty Genes. This talks about something a little different, but still in the same wheelhouse here. It talks about the 8 most common, what we call polymorphisms in genes, which is, it's just you have the correct gene, we have a patient with something called an MTHFR, which is, he can't process folic acid correctly, so he has to take a specific supplement for his specific, he's got the proper gene, he just doesn't express it right? So it goes into, you could be having an histamine sensitivity, so if you eat leftover foods and you tend to get snotty and nasally, it could be looking at something like that. That's another resource, kind of delves into that side of things. That one's a little bit more technical as well. But speaking about genes, so one thing that a lot of us don't think about, I want to say we're essentially science experiments, all of us that aren't aware of this, that do consume these things, are GMOs. And does anyone know what GMO stands for? Yeah, well, we all know, don't we? So genetically modified organisms, right? And this could be defined as a plant, animal, or microbiome that has had one or more changes to its genome. This could be done through artificial selection, which if you're ever debating someone about GMOs, they're going to be like, well, tomato hybrids are GMOs technically. And they're not wrong. We're not talking about, choosing 2 of the same plant species and creating a hybrid. We're talking about laboratory setting, introducing the gene from an entirely different species into a organism, right? So that's what this is. We're talking about genetic alteration by means of high-tech engineering in a laboratory setting, and not just picking different, cross-pollinating different species or different varieties, right? And I don't think that's a real picture. They don't get that crazy. So GMOs were first used in 1986 to put genes into tobacco plants so they can be herbicide resistant. And herbicide, you spray it on a field, it kills everything. And so this allowed them to spray the whole field and only tobacco plants would be remaining, right? Since then, in 1996, genetically modified soybean was introduced to the US by a company called Monsanto. Now it makes up 94% of all soy planted. And it's genetically modified soy is put into a ton of stuff. Anything you see on the back of a processed food box, right? It's going to say soy lecithin, right? Excuse me, or vegetable oil. That's corn or soy usually. And it also goes into be processed into biodiesel as well as animal feed. So 70% of all genetically modified soy goes into animal food. That's a whole different can of worms because a cow's natural diet is not genetically modified soy. And soy plants were genetically modified to resist glyphosate. This is a herbicide, so you spray it on the field, kills everything, right? And it's been labeled by the World Health Organization as a probable human carcinogen, and it's led to the emergence of superweeds. So what they were doing was spraying entire fields. It was killing everything. You know, weeds would come back eventually. Then they'd spray the field again. Maybe 2 or 3 weeds would survive and propagate. These were the strongest weeds, right? So natural selection going on here. And then they would spray again, and there'd be more and more weeds, right? So this allowed the emergence of superweeds, is what they're calling them. And these superweeds were now glyphosate tolerant, and farmers have had to start introducing stronger and stronger herbicides to combat these. And so they introduced a new chemical called dicamba. So in 2016, Monsanto decided to introduce a dicamba-resistant soybean. Shortly after, Monsanto also introduced their own version of dicamba, right? So they're producing the soy, the glyphosate, now dicamba-resistant soybean, and now their own dicamba. So they're inventing solutions to their own problems, essentially, and profiting on the way. And dicamba is known for its volatility and highly destructive as an herbicide. Since 2017, millions of acres of crops have been destroyed due to something called dicamba drift. And so this would be, if you lived near a farm that would use this, they would spray the entire field on their dicamba-tolerant crops, and through volatilization, it would go up into the air and go off, somewhere else and kill plants elsewhere, as well as spray drift. And so they would spray the crops, it would float in the air, go on to the next field, go on to someone else's property, right? It's their problem now.
You can visibly see that in Daphne.
You can? The die-off? Yeah, it can remain in the air up to 72 hours as it drifts, damaging and killing every plant that isn't genetically modified to resist it. And dicamba-resistant weeds have appeared in Tennessee and Illinois. So still early stages of seeing more super weeds, but I'm sure there'll be another chemical to work as an herbicide after that. So Monsanto was purchased by the drug company Bayer in 2018. I believe it was for $68 billion. And Monsanto, before the acquisition, had sued hundreds of U.S. farmers for patent infringement. And when Monsanto decided to patent soy, right, or we'll talk about corn and wheat in a minute, they're patenting a gene within life, right, within a plant. And so they own that plant. And so if we had a field full of genetically modified corn, and some bees came over and pollinated the corn and then went over to an organic farmer's area and started pollinating that corn, that's now patent infringement, right? Even though the farmer had nothing to do with it. The organic farmer couldn't control it. Monsanto's crops are being planted without their permission and consent, and they're not paying for those crops, right? So Monsanto, have sued hundreds of farmers for this, for patent infringement. Pretty crooked to patent life, in my opinion. And list of chemicals they've been sued for, however, Agent Orange, if you remember mentioning in the Vietnam War, they're still dealing with birth defects over in Vietnam. We were just looking at some pictures before this workshop. It's pretty gross. We've got veterans over here as well that were exposed to it, still dealing with issues. We've got dioxin, polychlorinated biphenyls, alachlor, I'm not sure what that is, Roundup, which is glyphosate, pencap-N, and dicamba. They've been sued for all of these.
Alachlor is a pond chemical.
Is it? And because of the ongoing litigation against Bayer for Monsanto's products, the Monsanto acquisition in 2018 is considered one of the worst corporate deals ever made. And so shortly after being purchased by Bayer for $68 million, they were hit with $68 billion. They were hit with a $10 billion lawsuit for glyphosate-related deaths and accidents, right? there was a landmark case where a farmer, terminally ill, was given, well, the settlement was for $289 million for a single person, right? They had determined that glyphosate was the cause of his cancer that was going to kill him. And thank you, Shane, for mentioning this. So there is a revolving door between Monsanto and the federal government. It could be USDA, I believe the FDA as well. And so this is an older one. You can see a lot of the previous administration players here, as well as Monsanto positions on the right. And so you could see, like the lobbyist was also working over here for the federal government. And so the guys who make our laws, who are supposed to be protecting us, were working for the companies that profit, if the laws kind of get brushed to the side. And it's not like they just go over to the government from Monsanto. They go back and forth, back and forth.
No.
We don't say that. And two more, corn and wheat. Corn's also in everything, high fructose corn syrup, corn oil. If you go out to eat anywhere, you're probably getting food cooked in either corn oil or soy or canola. It's been genetically altered to produce its own insecticide, Bacillus thuringiensis, in every cell, as well as to be resistant to glyphosate. I believe that's a spore of a bacteria, and once an insect takes a bite of the corn, it propagates inside the insect and their intestines, gets activated, and I believe it causes them to, doesn't explode, but yeah, they die off pretty quick. And glyphosate is used on wheat to kill the entire wheat crop at once, making it easier to process. So instead of cutting off the wheat, and some are decaying and processing a little quicker than others, if you just spray the whole field, it makes it a little bit more convenient for the farmers, right? The recent rise in celiac disease, I mentioned this on here because I've had several patients that have been diagnosed with celiac disease, right, an autoimmune condition, where they could go to Europe, where they don't use, I don't believe they don't use glyphosate in their wheat, and they could eat the bread over there, right? So they could eat something that they've been told here in America that their body can't handle, gluten, with no problems over there. And so there's a lot of theories going on that maybe what we're seeing is a misdiagnosis to maybe glyphosate intolerance, which I'm pretty sure we're all intolerant to, but maybe a reaction to the glyphosate in our food here. And glyphosate, keep mentioning it, Roundup, targets a type of bacteria present in the gut microbiome and has been shown to be both cytotoxic and have carcinogenic effects both inside the human body and outside in a laboratory setting. This was found in 2018 with a French study. You can see over on the right, they tested glyphosate in rats, and you can see tumors. You got, it had it labeled, it's cut off, but mentioning different organs. Oh, here's the liver, kidney. It's got spots on them with cancer. And this was after this product has been approved, right, for 20 plus years now. And the thing is with glyphosate, when you spray a whole field of wheat, or when you're spraying plants that are growing, they're uptaking that glyphosate. It's getting in the plants, right? It's just got a gene that makes it resistant to that herbicide. So we're eating this stuff, right, that has caused tumors in rats. And the World Health Organization has ruled glyphosate as a carcinogen and stated it can contribute to many of these diseases. One I found interesting was depletion of manganese in the brain, gut dysbiosis. So glyphosate targets a certain type of plant pathway that we don't have as humans. And so they would think that it wouldn't affect us negatively like it does plants. But we do have that mechanism or that pathway present in our gut bacteria. So it just wreaks havoc on our gut bacteria. And if you look back 2 workshops ago, Dr. Tiffany mentions the gut-brain axis and how changes in your gut microbiome play a huge impact in your health and chronic disease. Other than that, so what can we do about that? And over here I got different products, and they tested and found which percentage of those that they tested had trace amounts of glyphosate in them. And so if you're eating non-organic foods, you're getting chronic exposure every day to these glyphosate, Roundup, toxins. So shop for the least genetically modified crops, or even better, choose organic and non-GMO varieties. And I say refuse to participate in the science experiment because that's really what it is. it is, this has not been adequately tested in humans, and I guess we'll see in a couple more decades what it ends up doing to us. I would choose free-range, grass-fed, grass-finished beef, and opt for raw dairy products if you can find them. I know that gets kind of iffy. You have to search to find the raw dairy, but the grass-finished beef is a little bit easier. And the reason I mention that is because cows that eat soy their whole life, or they're finished on soy as well, soy's high in omega-6s, which is a unsaturated fatty acid, and you want to have a balance of omega-3 and 6s. So if you eat a ton of 6s, you'll be more pro-inflammatory, you'll have higher level inflammation, contributes to a lot of pain and disease. And they're lower in omega-3, which is your anti-inflammatory unsaturated fat, right? So cows that have been fed grass their whole life are higher in omega-3s and lower in omega-6s. But think about you're feeding a cow an unnatural diet, high in omega-6s, it's going to stress them out as well, stress their microbiome. These are not going to be the ideal foods for human consumption, right? And avoid processed foods, just to avoid that corn, the soy, avoid that wheat, especially those with the highest concentrations of GMO products. I believe that's it. So I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Tiffany, and she's going to talk a little bit more about microplastics.
BPA was found to have endocrine disrupting and carcinogenic properties, so cancer-causing properties, but they also affect our nervous systems. They can affect our immune systems. They're really not great. And once we found out that BPA was not good, companies were like, well, we need a hard plastic component to use to produce our hard plastics. So they went to BPS and BPF. And those were also found dangerous. So the reason they're dangerous is not only for the effects, but they never break down. These chemicals don't separate into their components like a normal chemical would. So that's kind of why we thought about plastics in a poor light before, but now we're looking more into microplastics. So microplastics are particles of plastic that are less than 5 millimeters in size, so they're small, and they're created from the breakdown of larger pieces of plastic. So let's say a plastic bag in the ocean is floating around, it starts to break down and break down and break down into particles that are not necessarily big enough for us to see or clean up. And they're now being found all over the planet. In one source I read, preparing for this, it said that we are finding plastics in the deepest trenches of the ocean and on the highest mountains now. And they can be categorized even smaller than microplastics into nanoplastics. So that's hard to do much with. And they can be ingested through breathing, eating, and drinking. And the breathing one was really interesting to me. Well, and it makes sense when you have a nanoplastic. But if you live near a water processing facility, you're more likely to have higher plastics content in the air and be able to ingest that through breathing. So if a plastic doesn't have BPA, BPS, or BPF, is it safe for us? And we are now finding that no, not necessarily safer for us. When a microplastic is consumed by an organism, let's say by a fish, in the ocean, and then something bigger consumes that fish, like a bird, and then something bigger consumes that bird, those microplastics get bioaccumulated in these organisms. And as we move up the food chain, that plastic ingested increases. So what do you think happens to the top predator in the food chain? Who is that? Humans. That's us. So these plastics can harm the organisms that consume them. So we're thinking just environmentally, the animals in our environment. So they can do physical damage, like blocking the digestive tract, and they can also alter feeding behavior of these animals. And like I said, what are the effects with us? So when I searched microplastics, the first 4 results were about the environment and how microplastics affect the environment and animals specifically. And it talked about more environment. And then finally, the last search talked about what they do by posing a risk to humans, physical, chemical, and other issues. And it's ironic to me that this source was a UK website and not a US website. So I was like, well, that's telling. So how much plastic do we ingest then? One study looked at microplastics being released in food containers. And it took a plastic container, heated it in a microwave for 3 minutes, and then took the water that it heated and poured that over a gold foil filter to filter out the microplastics to be able to then measure them. And it said in 3 minutes of heating the container, 1 centimeter squared of plastic, so we're talking small area of plastic, could release 4.22 million microplastic particles and 2.11 billion nanoplastic particles. They also heated a food pouch and found that that food pouch released even more plastics than the containers, the hard plastic containers. And this study also looked at the quality of the food, so whether it was acidic or not, and more acidic foods released more plastic particles. And then they also compared that to plastic stored in the refrigerator for more than 6 months and plastic stored at room temperature for more than 6 months. And the more acidic your food was, the more particles you had released. But you saw release of particles even in an unheated environment, just much less than the heated. So if we needed another reason to throw out the microwave. Oh, and interestingly in this too, this study looked at kidney cells. So they took kidney cells, applied those concentrations of plastics to them, and found that 70% of the kidney cells died in exposure to these plastics. Now, when we're thinking about concentrations of plastic, it's unlikely that we would ingest that high a concentration at one time. So it's not like our kidneys are being constantly inundated with these plastics, but accumulating over time, how is that affecting the cells in our body? Another study I saw talked about how we consume microplastics, and it looked at water sources. And it noted that those who consume water in bottles are consuming about 90,000 particles annually versus those who are drinking tap water who could consume about 4,000 particles annually. Now that's scary because we all think a lot about how we don't drink tap water, right? A couple workshops ago, we were talking about run away from the tap water. But here, if you resort to a plastic bottle, you're receiving tons more plastic. And you have to think about the transportation of these. When bottles are transported in these huge cases, they're in a hot truck, they're sitting in the sun outside the store where they're on sale, 2 packs for $4 or whatever. And so you're heating up that plastic and getting more particles released for you to then drink in. So what are our health concerns? If the animals are being tested and they're negatively affected by these plastics, what's happening to us? Plastics can absorb other harmful chemicals. So when you eat a plastic, you're not only dealing with the plastic, but whatever it's been exposed to and has absorbed. The plastics can be abrasive or sharp and can physically damage tissues. And then whenever you have a lot of buildup of plastic or foreign substances in the body, inflammation can occur. And we all know that chronic inflammation slows our healing, increases our pain signaling, and makes us generally less healthy. And one of the fun points about all this is that more study is needed. If you were to Google, are microplastics harmful? There are sources that say, your body gets rid of microplastics really easily, don't worry about it. But the truth of the matter is we don't have enough study for a lot of things. We were talking about glyphosate and how 20 years later now we're seeing a lot of issues. Think about things, I'm kind of going off topic, but think about like the popular weight loss drugs right now. How much research do we have on what these are doing to our bodies, specifically our brains? And we just say, well, we need more study, we'll find out later.
You mentioned if you Google, if you guys have, use a different.
Oh yeah, don't Google. I mean, if you internet search, DuckDuckGo.
Use DuckDuckGo.
Yeah.
Don't use Google.
Sorry. So when we look at plastics and tissues, another roadblock I came up with was that studies have been able to show accumulation in the body, and it's been tested in stool, lungs, and the placenta now even has been shown to have plastic accumulation. And the interesting thing about this is that those 3 sources of study are all open to the outside environment through body cavities. So we don't have a lot of information on plastics in closed organs like your liver, spleen, kidneys, stuff like that. But one more new study used infrared technology to look at hearts during cardiac surgery and test the different tissues and blood samples for plastics. And it did show that there were plastics in several different types of cardiac tissue, whether that was fat surrounding the heart or the heart muscle itself and the blood samples. And they even ruled out exposure from the tools used during surgery because the plastics that were found, several of them were not plastics that comprise those tools. So it's interesting to find that now we're even seeing plastic in our heart tissues. One source said we're turning into human Lego blocks. And that's funny, but kind of sad at the same time. So what are some of the common sources of plastics in our homes? The big ones, plastic containers we talked about. And that includes like to-go containers. Cans have lining that contains plastics. Bags, water bottles, cutting boards. One study I read talked about how cutting boards, when you're using the knife on the cutting board, it disrupts the surface and releases plastic. And the type of food that you are chopping on that board can contribute to the breakdown of the plastic even more. So like vegetables had higher components of like retinols and stuff like that, that will increase the breakdown of the plastic. And then another fun one to think about, sent me on a spiral, was the dishwasher. If you're washing plastic in hot water, well, you're not only releasing plastics into the environment, if you're using dishwasher pods, those are plastic. And then you're heating up all of your plastic cookware and storageware.
The liner's made of plastic.
Yes, of the dishwasher itself. Yeah. So throw out your dishwasher along with the microwave, right? Or I guess my husband would say just make your dishwasher stay at home. So what is the solution? Okay, so the solution to this is, okay, let's use less plastic, right? If we can't necessarily avoid it always in the air or in the water and our food, try as much as you can, but get rid of your plastic stuff. I mean, at this point, we know that if it says BPA free, well, okay, it's probably got BPS, BPF, or whatever cousin chemical they've put in it. So this is when it's gonna be all about avoidance, trying to switch to glassware and even the cookwares. That's another rabbit hole you could go down, but trying to make better choices like that to store and cook your food in. And then I'm gonna kind of switch tracks to go into maternal and paternal health and how your immediate choices can affect placental and fetal development. And I threw in here, it's not exactly genetics, because that's not what I'm talking about. So a lot of times patients will be telling me about their various ailments in our first encounter, their exam appointment. And they'll mention things like, well, my mom had, headaches, so don't worry about that. That's the normal headaches I have. Well, let's first remember that headaches are common, but they're not normal to have. You shouldn't be having daily headaches. That's not how we were designed to function. But they'll discount an issue because, oh, well, my mom had it. And a lot of the time, that's not a direct play of genetics. That is a direct play of lifestyle factors and habits and the things that you learned to do because your parents did those that way. So a couple of things that are actually better examples of common hereditary conditions like scoliosis, spondylolisthesis, that's where you have a break in a portion of the vertebra and it separates front from back. People can genetically develop a longer bar between the front and the back of vertebra and it can be weaker and thus break. If you've got spondylolisthesis and it's hereditary, I'm with you on that one. And then ankylosing spondylitis, it's an inflammatory arthritis, so it's just an inflammation of the joints that causes issues. I'm not convinced that's truly hereditary. I think that lifestyle can play into turning on that gene like Dr. Jordan talked about. But the way I like to frame genetics is that genetics are the cannonball, but your environment and what you put in and on your body lights the fuse to that cannon, okay? So in terms of that, maternal and paternal health, for a long, long time, research and just the general frame of pregnancy viewed the maternal factors to be what directly contributed to the health of a baby and the health of a pregnancy. We know that maternal mental health and the support systems that surround the mother contribute to a healthy pregnancy, as well as having good nutrition and good exercise and stuff like that. But what about dad? How does dad affect that? So reading into this, the health of the sperm supports fertility and increases the chances of becoming pregnant. For a long, long time, we would look at the health of the egg, the age of the mom, what's going on with her in terms of why she can't get pregnant. But now we're finding that dad's contribution of that has to be on par as well. The health of the sperm also affects the placenta. So it can increase or decrease the risk of preeclampsia in pregnancy, which I found to be so interesting because something you have no control over can give you a pretty serious condition that can lead into eclampsia and be, very dangerous for mom and baby. And then higher paternal BMI is linked with higher birth weight in baby. So not just what mom eats, not just having gestational diabetes, but also dad's weight can contribute to baby's health. And when we think about the amount of patients, especially I see who are pregnant, who come in and they're like, my induction is scheduled, they're gonna let me try, but baby's measuring really big. So I'm probably gonna have a C-section. And I'm like, man, that has a lot of implications for your health and your baby's health. That's a major abdominal surgery. Your baby's not getting the appropriate bacteria introduction by traveling through the birth canal. Now you're separated from baby post-surgery, and all of that can be just helped a little by dad's health being a little more active and healthy. So one interesting article I came across is titled "The Intergenerational Transmission of the Positive Effects of Physical Exercise on Brain and Cognition." So in this study, they looked at dads who were runners, and they looked at what genes their children inherited. And even if the offspring was sedentary, they had better mitochondrial health because the dad was more active. So he literally transcribed in those genes to bring in healthier cells and cell production through just his activity. So I like to say, everyone talks about it takes two to tango. Well, that's the same preconception, right? So you've got to have good health for mom and dad both. And the biggest part I wanted to leave you guys with on this is that these changes can be made at any time. So, we talk about the long-term effects of all the things we spoke about this evening and how that is something you can't necessarily avoid, but this is something you absolutely can. Preconception health, 3 to 6 months even before conception, makes a big difference in the factors that I mentioned. And then I wanted to leave off on the subluxation component. We wouldn't be a chiropractic clinic if we didn't talk about it. But subluxation is that misalignment that basically disconnects brain from body to some degree. And so that's essentially what our whole practice is based on. If your brain and body are not communicating effectively, none of the cells, tissues, and organs in your body are functioning like they need to. So when we look at these things that we can't always necessarily control 100%, do you think your body functioning as best it can without interference between brain and body, do you think that's going to do you better in response to all of these things than if you were subluxated and your body is not functioning as well as it can? And the answer is absolutely unsubluxated. So when I'm seeing moms, for example, and they're going in for a scheduled C-section, guess what I'm having them do that day? I'm saying come in and get adjusted before you go in for your induction or your C-section or whatever, so that we know you're functioning as best you can, so that your recovery is hopefully better from that increase in function. And I do the same. When I'm sick, I get adjusted. When I've had a busy week, or I know I've got a busy week coming up, I'm getting adjusted, so that no matter what my body encounters, I'm focusing better because of it. Okay? Do you guys have anything to add for that? All right. Any questions? No? Yeah. All right.
Trying to figure out the difference between glass and metal, which one's going to be better.
Yeah, I think glass too.
Kind of hard to cook in glass.
It is.
It is.
I think ceramic as far as food. And,
I see a lot of different stuff. Ceramic. We use like cast iron.
cast iron's good.
Cast iron food.
Stainless steel is good for cooking. It's tough. It's tough to get stuff to not stick.
Yeah,
Anything but Teflon.
that's a fun one. Yeah. Don't use the Teflon. Well, anyway, thank you guys for coming.
I
Yeah.
got a pen and I'm trying to figure out. It's not Teflon, but it's not stainless steel. I don't know what. it's made
Mystery
out of.
pan. Yeah, I don't know.
It works great. Nothing sticks to it.
So that's what makes me scared. I'm like, I think if the pan works too well, then I'm like, this is definitely not what needs to be happening with me. All right. Well, thank you guys for coming. Yeah.